as a fan, there's something really magical about bonding to a piece of work, and it just feeling like it speaks directly to you, and there's this feeling of connection with that creator. You know what I mean? Even though you've never met, and this can make for an interesting dynamic with your fans you meet, right? Who think they know you because you communicate to them so directly.
Well, the thing is, I mean, I started off as a fan. I mean, I was that tongue-tied kid who didn't know what question to ask or how to make a good impression or how to find out what I wanted. And I was lucky enough quite early on to run into people who were very, very gracious to me. There's a very famous British comic book artist called Frank Hampson who created a character called Dan Dare, which I loved as a kid. And I got to meet him, and he was so nice to me. I got to meet people like Will Eisner, who was an absolute gentleman, answered all my questions. Actually, this was before I had much of a name or a reputation. He very graciously spent 30 minutes, an hour with me, critiquing my work, listening to me, encouraging me, making me feel a fellow professional. So I know exactly what's going on in the fans' head when they want to make conversation or they want to ask you a question. And by and large, the overwhelming majority of fans are so, again, gracious and kind and polite. And I'm always happy to talk to them. You get the odd one who perhaps feels rather more entitled than he or she is. But I would deal with them as I hope I would deal with people in the real world, to just gently move away from them. But no, I love the interaction with fans. I love going to conventions. I love hearing what people think of my work. I mean, after all, I've spent most of my life kind of I'm not being flippant, but kind of in lockdown, in a room on my own, wondering, do people care? And when people obviously do care, and they tell you that the work that you've done in that way has had a positive effect on them, or has made them think, or has opened a door for them, that's just a wonderful thing. So, yeah, I'm really, really happy to have the interaction with fans. The guys that I spoke to on the Hero Initiative thing the other day, I'd go for a drink with those guys any day. You know, they were so charming and asked me such great questions, and obviously thought about it so much. So, yeah, that's me, an interaction with fans.
I think when you create such smart work, you're going to get smart fans. You know what I mean? Where like when I go to conventions, like if I'm at my kid's school event with parents of my kid's school, they'll say, "What's your favorite movie?" And they've never heard of my favorite movie or my favorite music. And then I go to comic conventions, and we're all listening to the same music and reading the same books and watching the same movies.
Yeah. Well, I mean, that's an interesting point as well, Chris. I mean, when I was growing up, when I was a fan, I knew maybe a couple of other people who were sort of interested in comics. They had nothing like my passion, but I was kind of the only comic fan for miles around. And then, of course, you end up going to San Diego or any one of these big conventions. There's 200,000 people. It's like, this is my nation. These are my people. And as you say, we've got the same influences. You only have to make one reference and you immediately are on the same page as a fellow fan. And yeah, it is a wonderful feeling of coming together and meeting up with the same kind of people, and they are the same kind of people. I'm pleased in recent years that it has broadened into not just white guys, you know, but there's much greater diversity, which is terribly enriching to the field as well. And also there's much more variety of subject matter. It's not all just superheroes. It's not just funny animals. You know, there's such a range of stuff now. And so I think as we've coalesced, that we've adopted new people into the family, and the family is much stronger and much richer for that.
It's funny, as you bring that up, I'm thinking to myself, my generation can thank you and the creators, you know, like you, who really pushed the envelope and the boundaries in what could be done here. And I was, go ahead.
I was going to say, I was lucky enough to be, right place at the right time. The way comics used to be in the UK, and I think probably in the US as well, was they were done by people who had a very kind of low opinion of the field. They were kind of drawing comics until they could get a proper job painting ads for companies or doing paperback covers or being fine artists. A lot of the writers, were waiting to write their great American novel or great British novel. But my generation, the generation that grew up reading comics and always wanting to do comics, we came into the field once we'd learnt our chops, once we were professional, wanting just to do comics, as has been the case for me. I've spent a happy lifetime doing comics. I've never had any real aspiration to do anything much outside of telling stories in words and pictures. And so I think that once you start to get people working in the field who were in love with the field, rather than just tolerating it or seeing it as a means to put food on the table, you then, the excitement and the interest and the love of the form just grew and grew and grew, from people like me who broke in the early 70s to people in the 80s, the 90s and beyond. So I think the thing that has been great in a way is that we've been able to take, my generation, say, has taken the torch and has passed it on and is now letting other people run with it. And I think if you love something, to have a feeling that you've enriched it or you've broadened it or you've enhanced it in some way is a wonderful, wonderful feeling to have.
Yeah. I was thinking about when you said, oh, let's talk about something nice instead of the current situation. Yeah, I was trying to come up with things I might enjoy talking with you. And just for my own ego, I'm curious if you remember when we first met, talking about fans, because I know you meet so many people and it kind of blurs together over the years, right? And then at some point it's just, oh yeah, that's Chris.
You're rather putting me on the spot because we've met, relatively frequently, and because we always have a nice chat. I really can't remember exactly the first time we met. I mean, I'm inclined to say it must have been in San Diego, but I'm not absolutely sure that is the case.
Yeah, so I'd love to share the story with you if you don't remember. So I had been self-publishing comics just for a little while. I think I'd put out about 2 or 3 of my books at this point. And so I came to a convention in Bristol, my wife and I, and I was nervous about meeting you, one of my guys, right? And I was still early, kind of going to conventions and meeting people and stuff. And my wife Elizabeth, she got a master's in psychology. You were talking about psychology earlier, and she has no interest in comics. She's never read them, and so I went to this show knowing you would be there, and I kind of saw you standing around, and I went up and I said, "Hi, I'm Chris, and I'm making a comic, and do you think you could consider making a pinup of a giant monster for me?" So that was my first, attack at you, and you said, and something along the lines of, do you plan on compensating me in any way for this? And I said, oh yeah, absolutely, yeah. And then interestingly, when we had that nice interview you gave me recently, we brought up that issue about how artists should respect themselves, right, as a commodity. And so that was my first exchange. And then that night, everyone was out at the bar or whatever, just hanging out. And I went, oh, there's Dave Gibbons. And my wife said, oh, let's go say hi. Because she has none of these, preconceived notions about, being scared or tense. And we just came over, and she went, hey, so my husband tells me you're Dave. I'm Elizabeth. And, she just talks about whatever. And we had a really nice time with you, and a really nice convention. And the second time I met you, had completed that nice pinup for me, and it was at Comic-Con. And so you hunted me down and got that to me. And so by then we were best friends, right?
Well, you've got so many best friends, Chris. I'm just happy to be one of them. No, well, I think it's strange. I think this, I don't know if it's a British thing, but there's never been the sort of distinction, I think, in Britain between fans and professionals. A whole load of us, myself, Brian Bolland, Alan Moore, Nick McMahon, Kevin O'Neill, Alan Davis, Mark Farmer, a whole load of people who finally made a name for themselves in American comics. We used to go to a monthly comic mart. It wasn't quite big enough to be called a convention. And next door to the comic mart was a pub. An Englishman of a certain age loved to go to the pub. So we all used to end up in the pub. And there were people who were working professionally, people who wanted to work professionally, people who did fanzines, people who were just interested readers. And we would all mingle together and have a few drinks and have a chat. And that's the way, honestly, that I evaluate people. I like to think that I don't think, this guy's a fan. I'm not talking to fans. Oh, this guy's a professional. I can talk to him. People are people. If people are decent, if people are nice to talk to, or you find a rapport with them, I don't care where on this spectrum of things you are. And I think most people are basically the same. And so I'm pleased that I treated you nicely, Chris, because yeah. I mean, well, why wouldn't I? You're a nice guy anyway. But I would say that it's interesting that your wife is a psychologist, because people tend to clam up when they find out you're a psychologist. I remember Pat Bastiani used to be in charge of affairs to some degree at DC Comics. She came over to England and I gave her a tour of my hometown. And towards the end of the afternoon, I realized all I'd done all afternoon was talk about myself. And I said, anyway, Pat, I'm really sorry. What's your background? What's your education? But she said, I majored in psychology. And I said, I better be careful what I say. She said, Dave, you said more than enough already. So I can remember your wife, Elizabeth, and I know you've got children now, Chris. I know so many people at different stages of their life. Just remind me, what's your child's situation?
I have two sons. They're 13 and 11 years old. And I think I've got a photo of you with my oldest, about this big.
Okay.
Yeah.
Wow, they're in their teens more or less now. Wow.
Yeah.
It's incredible.
Yeah.
Incredible.
The time goes so fast.
And are they budding psychologists or budding comic book artists?
I don't think they're either. Yeah. We're still waiting to see. My oldest one's really into drumming. He's a drummer. And
really?
He was really into basketball, and he's gotten onto the music side of things. My
Right.
younger son, he still loves the sports, loves basketball. Both of them love playing video games. So
yeah, well, I had to deal with a little bit of school and parent reluctance for me to pursue a career as a comic book artist, all meant for the very best reasons, because we all know being a comic book artist is not necessarily a guarantee of worldly success. And so I was absolutely sure that any child of mine, no matter what they wanted to do, I would always say, you do it, I'll back you. No matter, you have to want to stand on a street corner and play a guitar, fine. Anyway, my son announced when he was about 15 that he wanted to be a doctor. So he's a doctor. He did, however, have work published professionally and was paid for it when he was about 7 or 8 years old. I did a comic book that I wrote and Steve Rude drew called World's Finest with Batman and Superman. And we had to have a page in it, which was like a kid's version of Superman and Batman. And I said to the editor, my son could draw that page. And he said, yeah, that's fine. So Daniel, my son, drew it, and he got his Crayolas out and he got his DC Bristol board to draw on, and he did a really great flying Superman with X-ray beams and scary Batman, And then when it came time to get paid, I got rather a panicked phone call from DC, and they said, hey, this page in this comic book, this was drawn by a minor. He can't sign a legal release. You'll have to sign it for him. So I said, okay. So I signed it. and we eventually got the check through, and the check was for the half of the page rate, and they said, well, we can't pay him a full rate because he's only a minor. So I gave him the check and said, welcome to comics, son.
What a great story.
Maybe that informed his decision, but anyway, he was never particularly interested in comics. He was like your boys. He was really interested in video games, and he still pursues that to this day. He actually does a regular weekly podcast, although he's 40 years old now. He does this weekly podcast called Big Red Barrel UK, if anybody's interested, and it's a really good podcast. So he knows what it's like to be a fan, at least, and knows what it's like to be an enthusiast. And it's been a great hobby for him, a great pastime. Yeah,
that's a great story.
You got a dog as well.
Yeah. That's Annie there.
Old Annie.
She is trouble. She is a lot of work, this dog.
Yeah. We don't have a dog. We have a very big cat. I don't know if you're familiar with cat breeds. It's a Maine Coon, which is a big furry cat. They grow like as big dogs. So she currently terrorizes our garden.
I'm glad you brought up your son, because I was gonna kind of ask about family life and what family life was like being a comics creator. I don't know if you remember, but years ago I posted a photo. I was doing a comic book, and I had 2 pages drawn on one 11 by 17, and I'd work on it, I'd come back, work on it, and I came back, and it was scribbled in blue right between the 2 on the page, and I went, Boris, how could you draw on Daddy's comic book page? And he looked up at me, and he was so shocked, and he started crying. He went, Daddy, you told me not to draw inside the picture, and look, I drew in the panel. And I was so mortified, but I felt such love for the sweet little monster who was my boy,
Yeah. Well, I mean, funnily enough, growing up, my dad worked in planning, in sort of town planning and architecture, and he used to draw plans in the evening. So I've got memories of him in our dining room with his drawing board and the angle poised lamp and the cigarette burning slowly in the ashtray, and him drawing something. And I understood then that when Daddy's sitting there, he's working. I do remember one time going in there, and he had a box full of tools and pen nibs, and looking in there, and there was a loose razor blade in there, and I cut my finger, and that taught me don't mess around with Dad's stuff, So I was quite used to that, but my son, it was never really a problem. We only had the one son, so we didn't have like tribes of kids running around the house. And I know boys love to fight and rough and tumble and make as much noise. And good luck with the drumming as well. But that was never really a problem. I think the only problem is that sometimes you have to work slightly unsocial hours. I've always been quite good with keeping my work kind of in office hours, but you sometimes have to work the weekends. You sometimes have to be doing other stuff when you'd rather be with your family. So it is one of the pressures. On the other hand, to look at it positively, you can work when you work, and you can arrange your schedule. Particularly if you've got a partner who works, you have got a chance to organise it around that. So it can work quite well. But yeah, it's part of the job, really, isn't it?
What did your wife do?
Well, my first wife, she worked kind of in computers. She did data input to computers, and she later worked in accounting. She unfortunately passed away in the late 90s, but I got remarried to, my first wife was called Kate, to Helen, and we've been married for 17 years now. And her background is actually in nursing, and in the last job she did before she took early retirement, she was a health visitor. I don't think you have an equivalent in the US, but basically when you have your baby in hospital, it's delivered by a midwife, which was what she originally did. And then when you get the baby home, a health visitor comes to see you to make sure that you're coping okay and that the baby's well, and developing in the right way. So that was what she used to do. So again, both those careers were so far away from comics, and I think that's probably a good thing. I think you're so much inside yourself doing comics anyway, that to have a partner or to live with people who aren't in that little bubble is actually a very positive thing. That they help you step back from it, and they certainly can give you an honest opinion. And of course, I might be Dave Watchman Gibbons out here, but obviously, what it's like. No man's a hero in his own house. It's Dave, you got to put the trash out, or Dave, it's your turn to do the washing up, or which is great. That's really how it should be. I think you have to keep your feet on the ground, don't you? Even when you're. No, well, I mean that's actually one of the nice things about comic books, that you might be famous in comics, but you're not famous to the world outside. So if you feel you need your ego massage, go along to a comic convention or talk to people like you, but otherwise you're just this guy, so.
And that ties in a little to what you were saying about attitudes of fans at conventions. I think that the industry of comics, it's nice to get a little celebrity when you're at conventions, but in the grander scheme of things, we can't afford to have egos in this industry.
Oh, sure. I mean, it's easy to be a big fish in a very small pond or a puddle, but. And indeed, well, I mean, the whole question of ego, I suppose, shades over into the realms of psychology. I mean, I was talking to somebody the other day about collaboration in comics, which is a thing that I've always loved. And I've been really lucky. I've had a chance to play with some really great people. Obviously, Alan Moore, Frank Miller, Mike Mignola, Steve Rude, there's a huge list. But the most important thing about collaboration is you have to leave your ego at the door. You have to do what is good for the project, not what is your idea and it's going in because it's my idea. And all the best collaborators, and obviously people like Alan and Frank, they're not without egos any more than I'm not without an ego. But we all realise that when it comes to doing the work, to being creative, the ego kind of has no place in that at all.
Can you talk a little? You got into the industry as an artist, but you've written as well, and you've written and drawn your own work. You've written work for others, and you've drawn work that other people have written. How do you decide when your art or your stories are right, as opposed to someone else doing it?
Well, I mean, it's interesting because I look back on things that I did when I was a kid. Drawings I did when I first discovered and was thrilled by comics. And I never, ever just drew pictures. I always drew comics. I always drew pictures with balloons and things happening. So that was always the way I saw the art that I wanted to do. That was what fascinating me, not just drawing for the sake of draftsmanship or writing for the sake of poetry or beautifully constructed sentences. It was all about that combination of the two. So when I came to break into comics, my samples were of comic book pages that I'd written. But it's much, much easier for an editor to look at your artwork and go, yeah, you can tell in a glance if somebody could draw well enough. But you have to spend hours reading a story to know, can they tell a story? Can they pay off a series? So a lot of the early work I did was really drawing. And I was quite happy to do that. And of course, it's also part of learning because you get to read comic book scripts to draw them and you realize what goes into a good script. And you get a glimpse behind the curtain of how good writers work. But then a bit later, when I'd had some success with Watchmen and so on, there was the kind of halo effect that, if people read my name, they'll think it's somehow something to do with Watchmen, although I could only aspire to be the writer that Alan is. At least people go, if Dave hasn't got time to draw it, he can write it. So a lot of the early gigs I got were really because of that, I think. And then I showed that I could write comics. And I showed myself actually that I could write comics because I hadn't really written a lot since I was about 13 years old. And then I found that I really enjoyed the change of pace of writing because it's much less labor intensive. It's very intellectually intensive, thought intensive, but you can get through the material a lot quicker. And, you know, there's also the joy of seeing a really good artist send back what you've written, seeing how they've enhanced it and made you look so good, you know. So that was an interesting thing to do. And then it wasn't until quite a bit later that I did something that I wrote and drew completely, and that was the Originals, which was a kind of autobiographical graphic novel. But I actually found that really hard. It seemed to me, the best part of 2 years just sat in a room on my own, wondering, does anybody care about this? Is anybody going to bother to read it? And it was quite difficult. I mean, that does have a good payoff in that I got nominated for an Eisner Award, and I actually got the Eisner Award for, I don't know if it was Best Graphic Novel or Best Something. And it was in San Diego, and my wife and my stepdaughters, who had suffered through this with me, being kind of grumpy and, you know, not the happiest person. I mean, it also, you know, I wasn't miserable all the time, but it's really hard. It's you and the work, and there's, you know. But I won the award, and they were in the room to see me get it. So it did pay off okay. But it did make me think, actually, you know, the bit of comics I enjoy is the collaboration. So everything I've pursued since has been a collaboration. I have got an idea for a kind of a sequel to the Originals that I would need to draw. Whether I will find the time and the energy to do that, I don't know. But we'll see. If I get excited enough by the story, I'll just have to do it anyway.
So with that being the case, how do you decide? I guess if you come up with the story, you write it, and if someone pitches a story that you like, you draw it. Is that how you determine if you're writing or drawing? Or
yeah, I mean, most of the drawing gigs have been because I've got talking to writers that I enjoy, and you inevitably end up saying, yeah, wouldn't it be great to do something together? I mean, that was kind of what happened with Mark Miller and Secret Service. We'd known each other for a while, and we liked each other's work, and it was, yeah, let's do something together, you know. Quite often with the writing, it tends to be an editorial suggestion. I mean, I wrote a Batman Predator thing that was a suggestion from Dark Horse Comics, and the Green Lantern Corps, which I'd spent a couple of years writing later, that was Dan Didio at DC said, hey, Dave, you know, we really loved what you used to do with Green Lantern. Do you want to write and draw the Green Lantern Corps? So, you know, that's how that tends to happen. But I was saying to somebody the other day, what I've always tended to do is to keep a notebook where I'll write little bits of dialogue or story ideas or sketches. And it's funny, you look back through that, or even stuff I've heard people say, or things from the TV, little turns of phrase, and you look back on this, you think, hey, if I put that and that together, then I've got this story, you know. So that's my advice to anybody who wants to write, is keep notes, look out for stories, and they somehow, I mean, in the case of the Originals, which was autobiographical, most of that is things that actually happened. It was just a question of assembling them in the right order. So I think if you're a storyteller, even anecdote, even when you're talking anecdotally, you can't help but make stories, you know. And in fact, Chris, before you asked me, and even if you weren't going to ask me, I'm going to say it anyway. But one of the things I've been working on in the last couple of years is my autobiography, where I've done it as a series of anecdotes. It's not a chronological thing, you know, my early struggles, my later success. It's an alphabetical thing where it'll be the name of something I've worked on, or the name of a collaborator, or something, just to give me a hook to hang an anecdote on. So it's like about 100,000 words of anecdotes. And again, you know, I can't help but do it like that. Even this answer to you, it's a story. What can I say?
so it's the Dave Gibbons autobiographical encyclopedia.
Yes, it's an alphabetical anecdotal autobiography.
That's great. The way you just described how you write is exactly how I write, and as you described it, I realized it's from my music background, because I'm in a band in theory. It's been years since we've practiced or performed, but I still consider us a band. And writing songs, it's the same thing where I would just come up with a line to a song, or just a rhyme or a word, and then over time I've got these notebooks full of just little words or phrases, and then you pick and choose and go, okay, these all go together, there's a song. And I realize, as you said, I do write comic books that way too, a lot of my comic stories.
Well, that's really, really interesting you should say that, because I was thinking about that myself recently. I did one of these interviews a month or so back for Ed Pistor and Jim Rugg. I don't know if you know them. They have a YouTube channel called Kayfabe Comics, I think. And I really enjoyed talking to them, because they're really nice guys, much as you are, and they understand the field and they work in it themselves. And I got quite addicted to watching their channel. They did a great interview with Howard Chaykin, who's always entertaining. They did a really good one with a British artist called Brendan McCarthy. And Brendan was saying exactly what you're saying, that he tends to look upon comics as being like songs, where there's a kind of there's a musicality to it. You know, there's a rhythm, there's a melody, there's a theme, but then there are also the words that kind of interact with the music going on underneath. And I thought that was really interesting, because my favourite kind of music, I've always liked a good song, a thing in which the words and the music you can't take them apart, and you think of them as what I believe people call a gestalt. It's just, that's the way they are. You obviously think of people like Dylan, but I've always loved people like, and this is old school, I know, people like Elvis Costello or Crowded House, or, those kind of people who write such clever songs, which the music isn't the important thing, the words aren't the important thing. And it's the way the words and the music mesh to give a third effect. So I've been thinking about that, and I've been thinking, it's probably no coincidence that I love a kind of a hybrid art in a way like comic books, and a hybrid art like songwriting, which is kind of poetry meets music, So I'm really interested to hear you say that. I think that makes great sense. In that I agree with it. That's why it makes great sense.
Yeah, and you bring up if pictures are saying something different than the words, and Watchmen is maybe the first thing I know of that really took advantage of that. Were you guys aware of other comics doing that? Because I'm thinking of Stan Lee, Jack Kirby comics where it shows him thinking, and then a thought bubble is, I'm thinking now, where it just hammers you over the head. This is what, whereas the more sophisticated storytelling, was that something you guys were kind of coming up with and inventing, or were you aware of other people doing that before?
Well, yeah, I suppose we've been aware of it in artists like, or comics authors like, Harvey Kurtzman and Will Eisner, where again the word, you couldn't really tell where the pictures started and the words ended, and they would always have rhythm in their things and callbacks to earlier themes. And Kurtzman was quite a formal storyteller. He would have these set pieces where maybe the object you were looking at moved, but the background stayed the same, or everything stayed the same, but you as the observer moved around it. So with Watchmen, what we wanted to do is explore all the possibilities of comics, all the things you could only really do in comics, those kind of Eisner, Kurtzman things. We also knew it was going to be a really complex story, and I suggested to Alan that we did it as a 9-panel grid, because that would simplify the look of it. It would also help Alan write it, in that he knew exactly how much space everything was going to take on a page. It also enabled him to give kind of the language a form of poetry, because of the way it was going to have to be broken. And it sort of gave us almost like a rhythm track, or a click track, do they call it, So we were aware of all that stuff. And I suppose if we hadn't done it in that precisely formal way, that the music would have got music of it would have got lost. And also the other thing that was important, we wanted to make sure that every page was clearly a page from Watchmen. And by impressing that grid on it, and also by the way that John Higgins coloured it, which was a very particular palette, which is another side of the storytelling, which I don't know if there is a musical equivalent of that. Perhaps it's the guy on bass, you know, I don't know. But it's certainly by giving ourselves restrictions, or by giving ourselves like a time signature, we had to make it work in a certain way. So that to me was always a good example of creativity through repression, or creativity through restriction. I think, you know, that it has to be this and it has to be that and it has to be this. Now you've got a little closely defined area in which to be really creative, rather than just blah, blah, just go any way you like. If that makes any sense.
Oh yeah. It reminds me too of the poetry. I can't remember. Is it called Roku, where you're defined
Haiku.
By the haiku, the defined number of
17 syllables. Yes,
yeah.
It has to be 17 syllables. Yeah.
But then within that, it's wide open, right? So
yeah. Well, you know, that's something I used to really like about Twitter before they upped the character restriction. I used to like it when it was 140 characters, because you had to really think about how you were going to fit it. And again, it also reminds me of the thing, you know, I was talking to somebody the other day about this, and I didn't know who said it, and I still don't. But it was somebody very well known, a great writer, wrote a friend a letter, and at the end of it, he said, "I'm sorry I've written you such a long letter. I didn't have time to write you a short one." And, you know, that to me is where that art is. It's kind of honing it down and making, and again, that's the thing that I've always liked about comics, is that there is a restriction. You know, there's only so much visual information on a page. There are only so many words you can have on a page before it starts to drown. And so that is one of the things about comics that I've always liked, that you know, you're inhibited, so you have to be really clever in the space you've got left. And one of the great joys for me when I write stuff, and when I draw it actually, is to edit it down to the bare essentials. And again, just to ramble on, Chris, and I'm aware of time going by. I was saying this somewhere else the other day. There was only one time that I actually had to ask Alan to rewrite something in Watchmen. It was quite a complicated sequence where there was a fight going on and there was a lot of exposition coming out of characters' mouths. And I phoned Alan up and I said, "Oh, Alan, those latest 2 pages, they just don't work. There are too many words for the time that's elapsing in the pictures." He went, "Yep, you're right, Dave. That's what I thought. Just give me a day, I'll rewrite it." And the next day, I got the 2 pages with half the number of words, but just as well written. He hadn't lost the character of what he was writing, or the poetry, or the cleverness of it, but he just cut it down to half as many words. And that to me is genius. You know, that any writer will tell you, it's all in the rewriting.